Another desk jockey sent to play pilot? Look at her. She probably thinks a dead stick is something you find in the woods. The crowd of cadets, sharp and hungry in their midnight blue flight suits, let out a ripple of brittle laughter. It was the kind of laughter that sought approval, the kind that echoed the arrogance of the man who had just spoken. Lieutenant Commander Kalen Vance, golden-haired and granite-jawed, stood with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. He was the gatekeeper of this particular temple, the high-fidelity simulation bay aboard the newly commissioned deep space carrier, UNS Vanguard. This was the bleeding edge of fleet training, a place where legends were supposedly forged and weaknesses were brutally exposed. The woman he had singled out offered no reaction. She stood near the back of the observation theater, a small, unassuming figure lost in the shadows cast by the massive hollow displays. She appeared to be in her late 50s, her hair a mix of steel and silver, pulled back in a severe, functional bun. She wore a simple, unadorned gray maintenance coverall, the kind worn by civilian contractors or low-level logistics personnel, utterly devoid of rank or insignia. Her hands were clasped loosely behind her back, her posture relaxed but not slumped. Her gaze was not on Vance, nor on the snickering cadets. It was fixed on the central telemetry screen, her eyes tracing the complex flow of data with a quiet, unnerving intensity. But when the newly minted base commander, Captain Marcus Thorne, saw her stance on a remote feed in his office, his morning coffee paused halfway to his lips. He didn't see a desk jockey. He saw a specific, archaic form of parade rest, one that hadn't been taught at the academy in 40 years, a posture of profound, ingrained discipline. He saw a ghost. If you believe that true respect is earned in silence and proven by competence, type competence below. The air in the simulation bay was thick with more than just recycled oxygen. It was saturated with the pressure of expectation. The UNS Vanguard was the pride of the fleet, a testament to a new era of interstellar defense. And these cadets were meant to be its new blood, the sharp end of the spear. They had been honed, tested, and polished to a brilliant sheen, and Vance was their final arbiter. He saw himself not merely as an instructor, but as a sculptor, chipping away the unworthy marble to reveal the warrior within. His methods were famously abrasive, built on the theory that pressure makes diamonds and public humiliation culls the weak. The woman in the gray coveralls was a perfect, irresistible target. She represented everything he disdained. The bureaucratic bloat, the political appointees, the civilians who thought they understood the razor's edge of combat because they had read a report. He continued his monologue, his voice dripping with condescension. Let me guess, you're from the Appropriations Committee? Or maybe Fleet Logistics, here to see if we're wasting power cells? Don't worry, we'll put on a good show for you. Maybe you can write a memo about it. Title it, Observations on Things I Don't Understand. More laughter, this time a little louder, a little more confident. The cadets took their cue from their leader, their collective gaze turning to the silent woman, measuring her, dismissing her. She didn't flinch. She didn't blush. The torrent of insults might as well have been a gentle breeze for all the effect it had. Her eyes remained locked on the telemetry, her expression as placid as a deep lake. This infuriating calm, this absolute refusal to be provoked, was a greater challenge to Vance's authority than any shouted retort could ever be. It was a silent refutation of his power. He needed to break it. He needed to see a crack in that serene facade. He gestured to the primary simulation pod, a gleaming black sphere suspended in a web of gyroscopic arms. You know what? The final certification module for today is the IC-7, the Reaper's Gambit catastrophic system's failure in a contested gravity well. It's a real beast. Maybe our observer will like a closer look, a front row seat to failure. The challenge hung in the air, sharp and cruel. He was inviting her into his arena, not for a fair contest, but for a public execution. The silence that followed Vance's challenge was a heavy, weighted thing. It pressed down on the cadets, a tangible force that made their earlier laughter seem hollow and cheap. They looked from their cocksure instructor to the still, quiet woman. Her lack of response was a vacuum, and Vance's ego rushed to fill it. "What's the matter? Stage fright?" He sneered, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous bay. "Don't worry. The safety protocols are foolproof. You can't actually die in there. Though your dignity might not survive." He was projecting, painting her with the colors of his own insecurities, assuming her silence was a cloak for fear and incompetence. It was a fundamental misreading of the landscape, the kind of tactical error that gets commanders killed. The woman finally shifted her gaze from the data screen. Her eyes, a pale, clear gray, met Vance's for the first time. They held no anger, no fear, no indignation. They held only a calm, analytical curiosity, as if she were examining a malfunctioning piece of equipment. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then she spoke. Her voice was low and even, without inflection. "Understood, that was it." One word. It was not a concession, nor was it an acceptance of his terms. It was a simple, factual acknowledgement, as devoid of emotion as a machine's diagnostic report. The sheer economy of it was more unsettling to Vance than a string of curses would have been. He had expected a protest, a justification, an excuse. He had received only data. He blinked, momentarily thrown off his rhythm. He recovered quickly, masking his confusion with a bark of laughter. "Understood? Good. At least she speaks the language." He gestured grandly toward the simulator. "The throne awaits, ma'am. Try not to break it." As she walked from the shadows of the observation deck toward the gleaming black pod, the cadets watched her every move. They expected shuffling uncertainty, the hesitant steps of a novice in a holy place. Instead, they saw something else entirely. She moved with a strange, fluid economy. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Her feet fell silently and surely on the grated deck plating. Her hands, held loosely at her sides, did not fidget. She was a study in contained energy, a coiled spring disguised as a piece of driftwood. It was in these small, almost subliminal details that the truth of her was written, a language of practiced discipline that Vance and his students were utterly illiterate in. They saw an old woman in a janitor's jumpsuit. They were blind to the quiet professional who had spent a lifetime moving with purpose through environments far more dangerous than this glorified arcade. She reached the entry hatch of the simulation pod, placing a hand on its cold, metallic frame. She didn't look back. She didn't offer a final word to her tormentor. Her focus was absolute, pointed forward into the darkness of the machine. For her, the noise of the room, the egos, the insults had already faded into irrelevant static. The only thing that mattered now was the problem in front of her, the problem she had been invited to solve. Vance, watching her disappear inside, felt a strange, unwelcome prickle of doubt. It was a foreign sensation, and he quickly suppressed it, turning to the main screen with a renewed expression of smug superiority. He was still the master of this domain, and this foolish woman was about to learn a very public lesson about overstepping her bounds. The show was about to begin. A crisis was coming. Not a real one, of course, but a carefully scripted digital apocalypse. Vance strode to the instructor's console, a malicious glint in his eye. "All right, cadets, watch closely," he announced, his voice regaining its customary swagger. "Today's lesson is on catastrophic failure management. The IC-7 protocol, Reaper's Gambit, is not designed to be won. It is an exercise in managing the inevitable. The goal is not to survive, but to prolong the process, to make the right decisions even when there are no good options. It teaches you how to die professionally." He keyed in a sequence of commands, his fingers dancing across the touch-sensitive surface. On the main screen, the simulation environment materialized, the cockpit of a CFA-44 Nosferatu starfighter, floating in the high orbit of a gas giant, its swirling, malevolent clouds rendered in stunning fidelity. Inside the pod, the woman would be seeing the same thing, feeling the subtle hum of the simulated engines, the gentle hiss of the life support. Vance leaned into the console's microphone. "Observer, do you read me?" A single, static-laced click came back in affirmation. "Good," Vance smirked. Enjoy the ride. He pressed a large, crimson-red icon on his screen labeled Initiate Cascade. Instantly, the serene scene on the main display devolved into pure chaos. A cacophony of alarms blared through the observation bay's speakers. Warning lights flashed across the simulated cockpit. Main engine offline, primary avionics failure, hull breach, imminent orbital decay. Detected. The Nosferatu, once a graceful predator, began to tumble, a dead thing falling into the crushing gravity of the gas giant below. The cadets murmured, some wincing in sympathy. They had all been through this. They knew the gut-wrenching feeling of a ship coming apart around you, the futility of fighting controls that no longer responded. Most of them lasted less than 90 seconds before the simulation registered their fiery demise. Vance watched the telemetry, a predator's smile on his face. He was waiting for the panic, the frantic, useless jerking of the control stick, the desperate attempt to restart an engine that was notionally a molten lump of slag. He was waiting for the failure, but it didn't come. Instead, the data streams told a different story, a story of impossible calm. In the pod, the woman did not fight the tumble. Her hands, shown on a secondary close-up feed, moved with a surreal, methodical grace. She wasn't trying to fly the ship. She was triaging it. Her left hand danced across a secondary power distribution panel, a control surface so deep in the submenus that most cadets didn't even know existed. With a series of precise taps, she killed power to non-essential systems. The weapons array, the long-range sensors, even the inertial dampeners. She was hoarding every last watt of energy. Her right hand rested lightly on the control stick, not fighting the spin but using it. With tiny, almost imperceptible nudges of the maneuvering thrusters, she wasn't trying to stop the fall. She was subtly altering the ship's angle of attack, using the massive, failing airframe as a crude, atmospheric brake. She was thinking in 4 dimensions, predicting the interaction of her crippled vessel with the dense upper atmosphere it was about to hit. It was the calm of a master craftsman, not the panic of a victim. The movements were so efficient, so economical, they were almost hypnotic to watch. It was a ballet of pure competence, performed in the heart of a digital hurricane. The telemetry on the main screen was a thing of terrifying beauty. The red line indicating the fighter's descent, which should have been a suicidal plummet, began to shallow. It was still a fall, but was no longer a mindless brick dropping from the sky. It was now a controlled, calculated plunge. The cadets in the observation bay, who had been expecting a quick and brutal end, were now leaning forward, their earlier mockery forgotten, replaced by a growing, disbelieving awe. They were witnessing something that defied the very parameters of their training. Vance stood frozen before the console, his smirk gone, his face a pale mask of confusion. His mind raced, trying to process the data. She's using the emergency bleed-off from the environmental controls to power the control surfaces, one of the top cadets whispered, his voice full of reverence. No one does that. It's in the appendices of the old manuals. But it's a theoretical procedure. Vance heard him, but the words didn't fully register. He was watching the pilot's hands on the close-up screen. They were not the hands of a bureaucrat. They were the hands of someone who had an intimate, cellular knowledge of the machine. She wasn't just flying it. She was communing with it. The Nosferatu hit the upper atmosphere, a region of superheated gas and violent turbulence. The simulation should have ended there, the ship torn to pieces by aerodynamic forces. Instead, the woman used the death spin to her advantage, presenting the fighter's heavily armored dorsal side to the friction, letting it absorb the heat and stress. She was using the disaster itself as a tool. A new alarm, one Vance had never even seen trigger before, flashed on the screen. Manual atmospheric glide engaged. That's not possible, Vance muttered, the words escaping his lips without his consent. That system is locked out. It's a failsafe. You can't engage it without bypassing the primary flight computer, but she had. By rerouting power from a dozen other systems, she had created a new, ad hoc neural network for the dying ship, linking the maneuvering thrusters, the ailerons, and the backup power cells into a single, cohesive system she could control directly. She was no longer just a pilot. She was the ship's ghost, its new consciousness, forcing it to obey her will long after its brain was dead. The final seconds were a masterpiece of impossible precision. The ground, a simulated stretch of rocky, inhospitable terrain on a moon orbiting the gas giant, rushed up to meet them. There was no engine, no landing gear, no guidance. It was a dead-stick landing in the truest sense of the term. With one final, delicate adjustment, she used the last puff of gas from a maneuvering thruster to kick the ship's tail around, forcing it into a long, controlled skid. The screen showed a shower of simulated sparks, the screech of tortured metal, and then stillness. The ship slid to a halt, bruised and battered, but intact, right in the center of the designated emergency landing zone. A new message flashed on the screen, in calm, green letters. Simulation complete. Outcome: survival. 0 casualties for a full 10 seconds. The only sound in the entire observation bay was the gentle hum of the life support systems. It was a silence more profound, more deafening than any explosion. It was the sound of 100 assumptions shattering at once. The cadets stared, their faces a mixture of shock and reverence. They had just witnessed a miracle. Vance, his face ashen, could only whisper the words that echoed the thoughts of everyone in the room. No way. That's not possible. Into the stunned, cathedral-like silence of the observation bay strode Captain Marcus Thorne. He was a tall, lean man with a face like a weathered nautical chart, his eyes holding the quiet authority of 100 settled storms. He didn't look at the dumbfounded cadets or the pale, frozen form of Lieutenant Commander Vance. His gaze went directly to the simulation pod, where the entry hatch was now hissing open. The woman in the gray coveralls emerged, blinking once as her eyes adjusted to the light. She looked no different than she had before. Unassuming, calm, her expression unreadable. She stretched her shoulders slightly, the only sign of the immense physical and mental exertion she had just undergone. Thorne walked past Vance without a word, his boots making quiet, purposeful sounds on the deck. He stopped a respectful 10 feet from the woman. He didn't speak to her, not yet. Instead, he turned his attention to the main console, the one Vance had used to orchestrate his failed public shaming. The captain's presence was a gravitational force, pulling the focus of the entire room. The cadets straightened their spines, their awe now mixed with a healthy dose of fear. Captain Thorne was not a man known for his tolerance of foolishness. Computer. Thorne's voice was a low baritone, a command that expected and received immediate obedience. Run full playback of the last simulation. Isolate the pilot's control inputs and flight path telemetry. The screen flickered, replaying the impossible descent in a cascade of flowing green data lines. Now, Thorne continued, his voice dropping even lower, cross-referenced that flight path with the fleet historical archives. All classifications. Authorization. Thorne Omega-7. The cadets exchanged confused glances. The historical archives? What did a 30-year-old battle record have to do with this? Vance, finally shaking himself out of his stupor, took a hesitant step forward. Captain, I don't understand. It's just a simulation run. A fluke. Thorne cut him off with a single, slicing gesture of his hand, a motion that spoke of absolute command. He didn't even turn to look at him. Quiet, Lieutenant Commander, the computer chimed, a single, clear tone that cut through the tension. On the screen, a single file name appeared, blinking slowly. Archive File 77B. Classification Onyx. Match found below it, a line of text. Event Battle of the Xylos Nebula. Pilot Rostova. Service number 24601. Thorne stared at the name for a long moment, a flicker of an old memory, a deep and profound respect, moving across his weathered features. He had been a young ensign on a listening post when the garbled, desperate reports from the Xylos campaign had come in. He remembered the name. Everyone who had been serving then remembered the name. He finally turned, not to the woman, but to the assembled cadets, his eyes sweeping over their young, confused faces. The lesson was about to begin. Captain Thorne's voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but it filled every corner of the vast room, each word landing with the weight of history. 30 years ago, he began, his eyes fixed on the young faces before him. The 7th Battle Group was ambushed in the Xylos Nebula. It was a slaughter. Our carrier, the Indomitable, was lost with nearly all hands. A single squadron of CFA-22s, call sign Wraith, was cut off, their engines damaged, their munitions spent. They were dead in the water, adrift in a hostile sector with a compromised fleet behind them. He paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Standard operating procedure in that scenario is to scuttle your ship and await the inevitable. It's a hard truth of combat. But one pilot refused. Her ship was a wreck, its primary reactor melted to slag, its avionics fried by an EMP burst. It was, for all intents and purposes, a dead stick. A collective intake of breath went through the cadets. The phrase, so recently used as a casual insult, now held a terrifying, literal meaning. This pilot, Thorne continued, his voice now laced with a deep, abiding reverence, flew that 20-ton brick of dead metal into the gravity well of a rogue moon. She used its atmosphere to brake, a maneuver that no one had ever attempted, a maneuver that the simulators of the day said was a statistical impossibility. She saved her ship and her wingman, who was tied to her by a magnetic grapple. It was considered a 1 in a billion fluke, a suicidal act of desperation that, by some miracle, worked. The classified after-action reports called the maneuver Rostova's folly, because the top engineers at the Academy insisted it was a suicidal act of madness that could never, and should never, be replicated. Thorne's gaze shifted, finally landing on Lieutenant Commander Vance, who seemed to shrink under the weight of it. They stopped calling it that a few years later. They stopped calling it a folly when that same pilot, now grounded due to injuries sustained in the landing, rewrote the entire fleet's manual on advanced flight theory and energy management. They stopped calling it a folly when she personally designed the core software for the IC series simulators, including the very Reaper's Gambit you use to wash out your students. They built this temple, Lieutenant Commander, on the foundations of her madness. The final pieces clicked into place in the minds of everyone present. The unassuming woman, the archaic posture, the impossible calm, the name on the screen, Rostova. Thorne turned to face the woman in the gray coveralls. His entire demeanor shifted. The stern commander vanished, replaced by something else entirely, something akin to awe. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. He brought his right hand up in a salute so sharp, so precise, so full of 30 years of unspoken respect, that it seemed to cut the air. "Fleet Admiral Rostova," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority and profound humility. "My apologies for the informal reception. Your presence on the Vanguard is an honor we have clearly failed to appreciate." The rank hung in the air, an explosion of understanding. Fleet Admiral, the highest operational rank in the entire United Fleet Command. The room, which had been silent before, now achieved a new, impossible level of stillness. It was the silence of total, world-altering shock. The story of what happened in Simulator Bay 4 did not spread like wildfire. It spread like a ghost signal, a whispered legend passed from mouth to ear in the hushed confines of mess halls, in the encrypted data bursts between sister ships on lonely patrol, and in the quiet reverence of the barracks long after lights out. It became known simply as the Admiral's Run. The tale was not about the humiliation of a cocky instructor. That part was merely the setup, the necessary arrogance that gave the legend its sharp, satisfying edge. The true story was about the demonstration. It was about the impossible, made possible through sheer, unadulterated competence. It was a story about a woman who had walked into a temple built in her own honor, unrecognized, and had been challenged to prove she was worthy of entering. The cadets who had been there became the story's first evangelists. They spoke of it with a kind of religious fervor. They described the way her hands had moved, not with the jerky panic of a novice, but with the serene, fluid grace of a master musician playing a familiar symphony. They talked about the silence after the landing, a silence so total it felt like a physical presence, a moment when the universe seemed to hold its breath in respect. The Reaper's Gambit simulation, once a mark of dread, was transformed overnight. It was no longer a test of how to die. It became a pilgrimage. Pilots, both cadets and seasoned veterans, began requesting to run the IC-7, not with any hope of completing it, but for the chance to try. To attempt the Admiral's run. They didn't measure success in survival, but in seconds. How long could they last? How many of her precise, unorthodox maneuvers could they replicate before the inevitable crash? It became a new metric of skill, a secret benchmark known only to the fleet's elite. How far did you get on the run? Became a more meaningful question than how many kills do you have? It was a fundamental shift in the culture, away from the swagger of the ace pilot and toward the quiet, analytical discipline of the true professional. The legend grew with each telling. Some said she hadn't just landed the simulator. She had reprogrammed it on the fly with her mind. Others swore the lights in the bay had flickered and dimmed as she drew power from the station itself. These were exaggerations, of course, the natural embroidery of myth-making, but they spoke to a deeper truth. The fleet had been starved for a hero like this. Not a poster boy with a dazzling smile and a chest full of medals, but a quiet, unassuming architect of victory, a ghost in a machine who valued precision over praise. Admiral Rostova herself, of course, was gone by the next ship's morning. She had never intended to be discovered. Her visit was a simple, anonymous systems check, a final quality control inspection of her own work before the Vanguard was deployed to the Outer Rim. She had no interest in the fanfare, the apologies, the awe. The work was sound. That was all that mattered. Her departure was as quiet as her arrival, leaving behind a legacy that was already becoming more powerful than her physical presence. She left behind a new standard. Lieutenant Commander Kalen Vance was not formally disciplined. Admiral Rostova, in a brief, encrypted communique to Captain Thorne before her departure, had specifically forbidden it. A public reprimand, she argued, was a blunt and inefficient tool. The lesson had already been administered, and its true value lay in its absorption, not in its enforcement. Her logic was, as always, precise and unassailable. But the lack of official punishment was, for Vance, a far heavier sentence. He was left alone with his shame, a humiliation so profound and so public that no dressing down from a superior could ever compare. He had built his identity on a foundation of perceived superiority, on his ability to publicly measure and dismiss the worth of others. In one silent, 75-second simulation run, that entire foundation had been turned to dust. He was a fraud, and he had been exposed not by a rival, but by a titan he had mistaken for an insect. For days, he was a ghost on his own ship, avoiding the mess hall, taking his meals in his quarters, his every step dogged by the imagined whispers of the crew. He replayed the event in his mind 1,000 times. His sneering insults, the cadets' nervous laughter, her infuriating calm, the impossible telemetry, and finally, Thorne's earth-shattering salute. Each repetition was a fresh application of the lash. Finally, he could bear it no longer. He found her, not in person, for she was light years away, but he found her official contact channel through Captain Thorne. With trembling hands, he composed a message. It was long, rambling, and full of self-recrimination. He apologized for his arrogance, his prejudice, his unforgivable disrespect. He confessed his own insecurities, his reliance on a brittle facade of dominance. He hit send, expecting no reply. A reply came 12 hours later. It was not a long, philosophical treatise on forgiveness. It was not an acceptance of his apology. It was 6 words that would redefine his entire existence. Competence is the only true rank. Vance stared at the message, the words burning themselves into his mind. It wasn't a pardon. It was an instruction, a new mission directive. From that day forward, a new Kalen Vance emerged. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, obsessive intensity. The sarcastic insults vanished, replaced by brutally honest, technically precise critiques. He became the hardest, most demanding instructor in the fleet, but also the most respected. He no longer taught his cadets how to die professionally. He taught them how to think. He pushed them to understand a machine, not just operate it. He filled his lectures with stories of anonymous, unsung technicians who had saved ships with a clever power reroute, of logistics officers whose precise calculations had turned the tide of a battle. He taught them that the hero was not always the one in the cockpit. And in the entrance to Simulator Bay 4, a simple, unadorned frame was mounted on the bulkhead. It contained no photograph, no plaque, no medal. It held only a single sheet of printed plastic, displaying a series of elegant, impossible green data lines against a black background. The telemetry of a perfect, dead stick landing. There was no name, no explanation. There didn't need to be. It was a silent monument to precision, a quiet testament to the fact that true mastery requires no introduction. Those who knew, and those who didn't soon learned to ask. 5 years later, Captain Kalen Vance stood on the bridge of his own command, the UNS Intrepid, a state-of-the-art reconnaissance cruiser. His hair was shorter now, with distinguished traces of gray at the temples. The arrogant smirk of his youth had been weathered into a calm, watchful confidence. He was known throughout the Fifth Fleet as a demanding commander, a tactical genius with an almost pathological intolerance for ego and posturing. His crews were the best trained, his ships the most efficient, his officers the most professional. He was a living embodiment of the lesson he had been taught. He was addressing a fresh-faced group of ensigns, the newest additions to his crew, gathered on the polished deck of his bridge. This was a ritual he performed with every new intake. He didn't give them a speech about glory or honor. He told them a story. There are two kinds of officers in this fleet, he began, his voice low and steady, carrying the easy authority of command. Those who believe their rank gives them worth, and those who believe their worth gives them rank. For a long time, I was the former. I was a fool. He told them the story of that day on the Vanguard. He didn't spare himself, detailing his own smug cruelty, his blind arrogance, with a clinical detachment. He described the unassuming woman in the gray coveralls, her profound silence, and the impossible ballet she had performed in the heart of the machine. He told them of the deafening silence that followed, and the single, perfect salute that had shattered his world. As he spoke, the young ensigns listened, their expressions shifting from curiosity to rapt attention. This was not a story from the history books. This was a confession, a testament. It was the origin story of their formidable captain's philosophy. She never raised her voice, Vance said, his gaze distant, lost in the memory. She never needed to. Her competence was a shout. Her skill was a roar. She taught me that the stripes on your sleeve and the medals on your chest are just a record of where you've been. They're not a measure of who you are. That is measured in the quiet moments, in the work, in the absolute, unforgiving precision of your actions. The Rostova run was now an official, though still classified, module at the Fleet Academy. It was the final, brutal exam for aspiring command officers. It was still unwinnable. No one had ever replicated her perfect landing. But that was no longer the point. The test wasn't about survival. It was about character. Instructors didn't watch the telemetry for a successful outcome. They watched the pilot's hands. They monitored their biometrics. Were they calm? Were they methodical? Did they try to fight the chaos? Or did they triage it? Did they find the hidden pathways, reroute the last vestiges of power, and think 3 steps ahead of the disaster? The goal was not to land the ship. The goal was to demonstrate professional grace in the face of the inevitable. The goal was to be worthy of the legacy of the woman who had first flown it. The legend of Fleet Admiral Eva Rostova became a part of the institutional bedrock of the United Fleet. She remained a ghost, a name in a file, a figure spoken of in reverent tones, but almost never seen. She never attended the grand galas, never stood for a portrait, never accepted the public accolades the fleet command tried to bestow upon her. Her rejection of fame only amplified her myth. She became a symbol, not of a person, but of an idea, the ideal of the quiet professional. Her legacy was not cast in bronze or carved in stone. It was written in the calm hands of 1,000 pilots she would never meet. It was echoed in the quiet confidence of engineers who knew their systems inside and out. It was present in the methodical precision of commanders like Kalen Vance, who taught a new generation that authority was a responsibility, not a weapon. Her triumph in Simulator Bay 4 was not a personal victory over a single, arrogant officer. It was a philosophical shift, a course correction for an entire military culture that had begun to drift towards celebrating swagger over substance. She had reminded them, with one silent, perfect demonstration, that the most powerful force in the universe is not a supernova or a battleship, but quiet, demonstrated competence. True legacy is not what is said about you in your presence. It is the standard that continues in your absence. It is not the monument they build for you, but the foundation you lay for others to build upon. Admiral Rostova's foundation was built of silence, precision, and an unshakable belief that your actions are your only necessary argument. Her work was her voice, and it spoke volumes, echoing through the corridors of every ship, every station, every training hall in the fleet. It was a legacy of doing, not of declaring. It was the understanding that in the final analysis, when the alarms are screaming and the ship is coming apart, words are meaningless. Assumptions are fatal. The only thing that matters, the only thing that will ever matter, is the calm, steady hand on the controls, the quiet mind that sees the solution hidden within the chaos. That is the truth. That is the standard. That is the legacy of the woman in the gray coveralls. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption and where silent action defines a hero's worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.